So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to Cesar for hosting us. I'm Ana Rey and I work in this building, and you might have seen me. And I'm very happy to introduce and present Professor José Grünzweig. I have known him for many years. I have collaborated with him many years, but I still don't know how to pronounce his name. He's a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel. He's a plant ecologist working on ecosystem and soil and plant carbon and water balancing, mostly in dryland ecosystems, hot and cold dryland ecosystems. And now he has introduced this concept of dryland mechanisms for ecosystem functioning, and calling the attention that is actually emerging in other kind of environments, more mesic environments. He grew up in Switzerland working on temperate forest. He had postdocs in Alaska working on boreal forest. So now he wants to highlight the need to understand these dryland mechanisms and the importance that they have in the context of climate change because they are occurring elsewhere. So he's going to talk about this today. So thank you.
Thank you for the great introduction. You actually told everything that I wanted to say. And thank you for coming. Yeah, so my intention, the intention of this talk is to make you aware of dryland mechanisms. So I have to define what it actually is and what it means, and then try to make the point that these dryland mechanisms could be relevant for adaptation of more humid ecosystems to climate change, particularly drought and heat. The background is the drought that we are all experiencing, not only in the dry regions, and here you can see the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index, which takes into account precipitation and the demand for water. And during these years, this is from a recent paper where I was part of, you see Spain in spring and summer, and spring plus summer 2019, it was very dry. In 2022, it was even drier. But all across Europe, you see the drought that's struck many countries during these recent years. And so this is the background on which we're talking about the rest. And I'd like to work or talk from the perspective of drylands. This is what it looks like in Israel during the summer. Obviously here, most ecosystems looks pretty similar. There's absolutely no rain in Israel in the summer, whereas here you can have some, maybe some years no, but other years you will have more rain. In Israel, there's no rain in the summer, meaning mainly from May to September, maybe October. And the question is, okay, this goes on for millennia. How are dryland ecosystems coping with dryness? I don't need to tell you that there are many drylands in the world. So right away to what I'm going to talk about. So the first question was, how are drylands coping with dryness? And I will talk about something which I call universal processes, just to distinguish the dryland mechanisms from these general processes. And then several topics to the question whether humid ecosystems can adopt dryland mechanisms as adaptations to drought and heat, and then what is the contribution of those dryland mechanisms to functioning. And we will go through several issues here that I don't need to talk about now. So the first thing is, what is the difference between a process that occurs everywhere and does not need any distinction from such dryland mechanisms. And I will talk, I will show, I can show you soil CO2 emission as such a universal process. We call it also soil respiration. It's not the soil which is respiring, but we measure CO2 being emitted from the soil, and that's why we mostly call it soil respiration. And it's a universal process because the source of this CO2 is respiration by organisms, microorganisms in the soil, and roots in the soil. And every organism which is alive respires and produces CO2 everywhere in the world. And that is a good example of universal process. And now, how is such a universal process responding to drought? We can see here some of our work from the past, where there are two ecosystems, a semi-arid one and an arid one in Israel again, over about 1.5 years, where we made manual measurements. Today we have nicer instruments, but back then there were not many automatic ones. And there was different treatments. That doesn't matter right now. A control, a wet and a dry treatment. And we see, and here you can see the rain, more rain in the semi-arid than in the arid region, no rain in the summer, as I pointed out already. And in general, we have higher rates in this semi-arid than in this arid region. And when we try to, or when we modeled this, when we produced an empirical model, a statistical model, it was based on, to explain this soil respiration, it was based on temperature, soil temperature, and on soil moisture. Meaning that the warmer it gets and the more moist it gets, the more respiration we have, or the other way around, because we talk about drought now. The drier it gets, and the colder it gets, but particularly for the drought here, the drier it gets, the less respiration there is. So in the end, we have less CO2 emission from the soil when it becomes drier. And this is very general, and it's applicable everywhere. So nothing special about this, whether it's in drylands or in temperate regions or in boreal or in tropical regions. But now let's move to this dry region. In the summer, where I told you there is no rain and will be no rain. And we focus on litter now because this is what we worked on during that time also. We can see at night and during the day from 3 different plant species, this litter is producing CO2. You see some CO2 being emitted from this litter material, no soil, just litter at night and also during the day. And here's something new comes up, because I told you that there is no rain, so there should be no water. And how is CO2 produced if there's no water? Because before I showed you an equation, and if if respiration or if soil moisture was 0, in this case litter moisture is 0, there should be no CO2 coming out of it. So to better understand it, let's have a look at the conditions. This is again the same figure about the CO2 production from litter, and these are the conditions. Radiation, this is UV radiation at night, obviously none, and during the day, relatively high UV radiation. Temperature during the day, very warm, very hot. During the night, about 20-25 degrees, which is nice for organisms. And this is the moisture of the litter. During the day, yes, there is not much because it's dry, and there is always a little bit of hygroscopic water, but this is little. But surprisingly, at night, there is some water in this litter material, around 25 to 30, 35%. But and here you can also a little bit see that this litter material is dark, and this is because there's some moisture on it. Well, now the question is, where does this water come from if I told you that there's no rain? And in the beginning, we're a bit concerned about how can that be? Any idea? Dew is the first thing we thought about because, okay, well, dew, can it do so much? We didn't know. We also saw many nights when there was no dew and still there was some moisture on it. And so the concept went that, yeah, dew is a possible moisture. Fog, if there is some fog, like you can see a little bit in the picture here. And but actually it's enough that the relative humidity is high at night. We're here in this, we're a few kilometers from the Mediterranean Sea here. There's always a source of moisture, of humidity, and this can be absorbed by this litter material. So actually, there are many organisms in dry lands which rely on these alternative sources of water. We call them non-rainfall. I shouldn't point with that because you can't see that on Zoom. They're called non-rainfall water sources, and very many different organisms are using this, including trees through their canopy. There are ways of absorbing water by the leaves through the stomata and through the cuticula, possibly through some other structures in the leaf, where a leaf can take up water, even rainwater, but also other sources, also non-rainfall sources of water can take them up. So these are actually dryland mechanisms, how we define them, and I will define in a moment what dryland mechanisms are. But at night, when we have moisture, the mechanism of decomposition would be microbial, because the microbes can exist and can be active under these conditions. This is enough moisture to be active. And we call that humidity enhanced microbial degradation, which is enabled by these non-rainfall water sources, such as dew. During the day, the moisture is low, but the radiation is very high, and it has been shown during the process when we started to work on this, it was shown that such plant litter material can produce CO2, or at least can decompose by photochemical activities. It's called photochemical degradation or photodegradation, and the radiation, which I call here photochemically active radiation, the proper term is actinic radiation, which is just a translation of what I wrote here. So during the day, there's a lot of radiation. There's no moisture, so the microbes would not be active, but they are there, and they wait for the next night to come and for the moisture to being absorbed again and to have the next round of activity. There's also a third mechanism, which is called thermal degradation by high temperature. I will not further talk about that. We often have a combination of that because, as here, it's hot and dry during the day, and there's a lot of radiation during the day, so they often go together. So we use this as an example and the starting point for such dryland mechanisms. And in this paper that we published 2.5 years ago, we defined such dryland mechanisms as a process or a series of processes which are affecting organisms and ecosystem functioning, which operate under relatively dry conditions or under very dry conditions. They're driven primarily by heat, non-rainfall water sources, water pulses, and or intensive solar radiation. And we know of them mainly from drylands, like what I showed you now as an example, this litter decomposition mechanisms. But in the paper, we made the point that they will most probably, or at least some of them, become relevant in other regions globally in a changing climate. Right. Any questions so far? And feel free to ask questions because I don't want to lose you. So, good point. Yes. And I will give examples on this about photodegradation, and also the dew degradation. But they have been found mainly in drylands because in drylands we had to look for other ways. Like me, when I started to work on litter decomposition in in Israel, this was because I worked in the field and I worked in a pine forest near the desert, and the litter started to fall every year. There is some litter fall in June, July, and August, and it was brown. And by October or so, before the first rainfall, this brown litter material turned into gray. So I thought something must happen here. I didn't know what, but you need to be creative in the drylands if you want to understand what's going on, because the paradigm goes that there's no rain, so there's no decomposition. So wait until the rain comes and then start to study decomposition in drylands. But I saw that this brown material turned into gray material, so something must have happened. Having said this, I will show you that photodegradation, for example, should actually be and is actually happening everywhere to some extent. Of course, the question is to what extent, but at the moment, we talk about to some extent, and that it could become more important when it becomes drier. Did this answer your question? Thanks. Anything else? Yeah. That I showed before. These where I showed you where we worked. Yeah, so the soil respiration, the semi-arid region is about 300 millimeters per year, all in the winter. And the arid one, no. Now, what did I call semi-arid and arid? There's always an issue, at least in Israel. We call climatically arid region, we call them semi-arid because of the vegetation. So the semi-arid was 540 around millimeters, and the arid was 300. And this was from a gradient study, which went from 100 to 800 or so. Yeah, but typically this is what's going on, and the aridity index can be anywhere from below 0.2 to 0.45 or something like that. Okay. Okay. So this is a very general definition of what dryland mechanisms are. It's just a description more than a definition. We showed examples of 12 such mechanisms in this paper, and I'm going to focus on some of them. When asking the question about whether humid ecosystems can adopt such dryland mechanisms as adaptation ways of adaptation to drought and heat, and what is the contribution to their functioning. Now, adaptation here is taken from the IPCC report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. So I don't talk strictly about strict biological adaptation, which is an evolutionary process, but anything related to adjustment to climate and its effects. So it would include my term of adaptation here, and the one used by IPCC includes acclimation. But I just like to use this term rather than adjustment. And so this is how I will use adaptation here. The first chapter is about dryland mechanisms that operate in humid ecosystems under normal humid conditions. This is from a temperate deciduous forest in Japan. Obviously, relatively low temperatures, so no big heat here, a lot of precipitation. And this was a study on photodegradation and its contribution to annual carbon loss from leaf litter in such forests. And you can see a different forest here, but there are gaps where solar radiation can get through. There are times in the year where solar radiation can reach the forest floor, and photodegradation can take place. And they calculated that if they have a forest with 20% of forest gaps, the contribution under this normal climate here of photodegradation to the annual leaf litter carbon loss is 13%. So under normal conditions, they know this litter will decompose to a certain degree, and 13% of it is contributed to by photodegradation. So this answers some of your question about why is this not going on today? Well, it is. This is from a similar forest in northern Belgium, a modeling study that we included in our paper on the dryland mechanisms. And I want to focus on the current conditions, which is no increase in temperature and no decrease in precipitation. And even under these conditions, the simulations modeled around 20% of the annual loss of litter mass being contributed by photodegradation. And this is in a forest gap. So it corresponds to this former study that I showed you. So that even the model knows, well, this was a model that was trained with our data from Israel, and it then simulated that relatively high amount of or fraction of litter decomposition is being contributed by photochemical degradation. So this was just to show you an example of one dryland mechanism, photodegradation, taking place under current conditions. Now I will talk about another, well, now the topic is dryland mechanisms operating in humid ecosystems, but under dry conditions. And these dry conditions are natural. So some of these forests that I will talk about have dry periods during their growing cycle, and they are adapted to that because they evolved under these conditions. And I will introduce another dryland mechanisms, which is called hydraulic redistribution. You might have heard about that. At the beginning, it was called hydraulic lift, and I will show the lift, but it can distribute in all directions. Very shortly, this is during the day. The top soil is relatively dry. but has some water. The bottom soil is wet, so the water potential is highest in the deep soil. It is lower in the topsoil, and the water potential is lowest in the canopy. Actually, lowest in the atmosphere, but in terms of the of the plant, it is lowest in the canopy, and that's why the water is moving from high and higher water potential to lower water potential and then into the atmosphere. Okay, this is how we know water is moving. But at night, stomata are closed, and the water is still moving up into the canopy, and the water potential in the canopy is getting higher. At some point, the lowest water potential in the system is in the topsoil. And that's why the water starts to move in the roots in the wrong direction towards the soil and actually out into the rhizosphere. And the next day, this water is being taken up again. And that's why it's called hydraulic redistribution. This is water from the wet deep layer being moved into the top dry layer. Very short. And there are a lot of benefits to the tree and to the ecosystem because of that, because the roots in the topsoil, they have an increased survival rate because at least some of hydraulic failure in roots is being prevented. The water is being taken up from the rhizosphere again, and this can contribute to nutrition because most of the nutrients are in the topsoil. Some water can be transferred even to mycorrhizal fungi, which will contribute to nutrition for the trees. Some water might be taken up by other plants which don't have deep roots and cannot produce or cannot do hydraulic relief. And these are some of the benefits and the advantages of hydraulic contribution in such ecosystems. Now there are two examples. One is Douglas fir and ponderosa pine forest, a very wet one in Oregon, in the northwestern United States, but it has some summer drought. And under these conditions of summer drought, these trees are adapted to that. And around 30% of the water that is daily removed from the top 2 meters of the soil is replaced at night by water that is being redistributed from even deeper layers. So at night being taken up and released into the top layer of the soil, and then during the day being taken up again. And this gives these trees 16 to 20 additional days of water in the upper soil layer, which is very important for example, for preventing embolism and hydraulic failure in roots. Another example is from a subtropical climate in Georgia in the United States, where the soil is very porous, sandy, so very well drained, and very often in the summer is very dry. And again, here we see that 30% of the total rainfall and 40% of the total tree water uptake is being contributed by hydraulic redistribution. So these are two examples. These are two examples of natural conditions and forests that make use under current climatic conditions of dryland mechanisms. In this case, it is hydraulic redistribution. Okay, any questions about that? So I made 2 points right now. The first was that under humid conditions, there can be, we can actually see and measure contribution of dryland mechanisms to ecosystem functioning. And in the second one here, that there are naturally dry conditions where here the trees make use of a dryland mechanisms for their survival. But the next step is now look into humid ecosystems, but under climate change induced heat and drought. And to see how such dryland mechanisms can contribute to the adaptation to these new climate conditions. This is from the same modeling study that I showed before in Belgium, where we saw that photodegradation contributed around 20% to annual litter decomposition, even under current conditions. But now when the temperature gets warmer under these simulations and precipitation gets lower, then we see a general increase in this contribution of photodegradation to litter decomposition. Total litter decomposition will go down because it is drier. But some of it is compensated by photochemical degradation. And let's go back. This is by photochemical degradation. There's another figure that I don't show now, but also we also simulated microbial degradation enabled by dew under these conditions. This is in a gap, and the other one was under the canopy. And we could also show that some of this loss of decomposition or this reduction in decomposition because of drought is being compensated by this humidity enhanced microbial degradation. So these mechanisms are compensating for some of the reduction in litter decomposition. And the next is from a recent paper from Germany, where they could show in a so this is a simulation study. This is a manipulation study in the forest, a through-fall exclusion experiment on beech and on spruce. And for the beech, they calculated that hydraulic redistribution contributed to 10% of the daily transpiration of mature trees. So they had through-fall exclusion. The rain did not reach the ground. And this started to dry out the topsoil and hydraulic redistribution. These beech trees, mature beech trees, could redistribute the water from deeper layers to the dry upper layers. And this contributed to 10% of the daily transpiration over this dry period in the summer. So two examples before I get to the next one, which is a new dryland mechanism. Two examples of climate change-induced drought and the use of a dryland mechanisms and its contribution. It's always important to calculate how much it can contribute to ecosystem functioning or plant functioning also in this case. I want to introduce another dryland mechanism, which is called the canopy convector effect. I also need to keep that very short. So you have here the flow of air over a forest. And once the air is closer to the forest, to the trees, it starts to produce turbulence. And the turbulence, and there's also some topography here, so you can get even higher turbulence. But under these conditions, forests are defined as having a high surface roughness. And this is caused by this turbulence. And the high surface roughness lowers the resistance of heat transfer between the forest and the atmosphere. So it sort of allows heat to being more easily moved from the hot surface of the forest to the atmosphere above it. And this is air cooling, because the forest is warmer than the air, and it's air cooling by convective heat flux. Is like if you put your hand over a convecting oven, and you can feel the heat coming up. So this is a similar way, a similar way of getting heat out of the forest by this flux. And this is obviously very important for under certain conditions, because trees need to cool themselves. So this is an example from an earlier study, which tested the temperature at ecovariant sites in different places in Europe in summer 2003, which is very well known as a very dry, extreme dry and hot summer. And here was an example from a later one. And we see here the temperature difference between these hot periods and the same date a few years earlier when it wasn't that hot. And how much, and compares two different nearby ecovariant sites, a forest in green and a grassland in orange. And this is over the course of a day, 24 hours. And you can see during midday when it's hottest, and the difference between the temperature during this hot period and the cooler year earlier on. We see that the temperature is higher in the grassland than in the forest, both in this case, and in this case in France, the difference is even much higher, or 3.5 degrees. And now my interpretation of these data is as follows. The forest can much more easily transfer heat convectively by from the forest to the atmosphere. And that is because of the low resistance to convective heat flux. It reduces the surface temperature of the forest, and it allows the forest to save water. Whereas the grassland has no convector effect, because the surface is very smooth. You have much less turbulence being produced over the grassland, and the temperature remains higher. And to get some cooling, the grassland needs transpiration. So, which means that to get some cooling, water needs to be used, which is a waste because the water is scarce during this time. And so altogether, the forest can save water, the forest can cool itself more than the grassland, and it is in a better condition during this time because of this dryland mechanism that is called canopy convector effect. How much time do we have? A minute? 10 minutes. Well, that's plenty of time. Because I want to, well, this is from the same paper about comparing the recent drought years and earlier years, and the damage that has been caused by this drought in different countries across Europe. You can see in Spain, for example, there was significantly more tree cover loss over these years compared to earlier years, and significantly more defoliation of both broadleaf trees and conifers. And this occurs in most of the countries in Europe. So these are damages or let's call them disturbances in general. And I would like to use them to show you that they might contribute to adaptation to climate change. Which has not been found in Spain, but in other places, is also a significant increase in insect pests, like bark beetle, and in forest fire. So if we take this together, such as fire and extreme heat and extreme drought and maybe more pests, then this can lead to a forest which has less trees. So it's a less dense forest. It might produce gaps. There are some dead trees. And let's have a look what dryland mechanisms can or how dryland mechanisms can help to adapt to these conditions. For example, fire and drought that produce these gaps. The soil surface can become hydrophobic. And soil hydrophobicity is another dryland mechanism that we define. Particularly after fire, the organic matter becomes very hydrophobic. And this has been viewed as a negative thing, but it has aspects that are positive. For example, it might prevent the upward capillary movement of water and then the evaporation to the atmosphere. So more water may stay in the soil. When the rain comes back as a short pulse or as a longer period, some of the water will be horizontally redistributed, which is again another dryland mechanism. It will run off and might reach other trees and actually give those other trees extra water. And then soil hydrophobicity is known to produce preferential water flow paths, which means that if the rain goes on, at some points this surface is being broken and the water will move in, but instead of uniformly moisten the soil all over, the water flows further down, finds its way into the deeper soil. And what this might cause, it might enrich the deep water. And we already talked about deep water, if you remember, because this will allow hydraulic redistribution, which will benefit the tree and might benefit some other plants that don't have access to that water. And so we have a bunch of dryland mechanisms that can help in human language, help the trees and the ecosystem to cope better with climate change. There are other possible ways. This is a forest with now some of the trees died and it is less dense, and even the canopy can be less dense. And under these conditions, the sun might penetrate, and some of the litter that is falling on the ground is being decomposed by photodegradation or by humidity-enhanced microbial degradation. Some of the water might be taken up by these less leaves now through the canopy, for example, by dew or fog. The canopy convector effect will work better in a more diverse, less dense forest, which will allow extra heat to be released from the forest. When it rains, there can also be drying wetting cycles when the topsoil dries out and then it's being wetted and new processes will start. And this is a complex mechanism by itself. And the last topic I would like to talk actually is going one step further. So we saw that climate change can cause some disturbance in the forest, and we know that this happens. And under these conditions, there might be enhanced activity of dryland mechanisms that can contribute to the remaining trees and plants and other organisms in the ecosystem to adapt to climate change. But we might also help through land management. And this is just an example of forest management tools that very often are being discussed anyway. This is lowering tree density, creating gaps, small gaps, and diversifying the structure of the forest rather than having a uniform, dense spruce forest, like in many places in Western and Central Europe, have a more diversified multi-species and multi-age stand. Now, what will that do? The canopy convector effect will be more efficient because there's more turbulence being caused. The aerodynamic resistance to convective heat flux will be even larger than it would be in a more unified, in a more uniform forest. Soil hydrophobicity might, because of the drought, might be formed in some layers in the soil, which again prevents some of the evaporation of water, which will enable preferential flow and filling of the deep water reserves and enable hydraulic redistribution. Photodegradation might decompose some of the litter rather than having it pile up under the trees and absorb some of the water that so this is another thing which I haven't talked about, but if you have ever more litter on the ground, and we know that this happens in through fall exclusion experiments, that you have more and more litter on the ground. When some rain falls, it is first absorbed by the litter, and it might not reach the ground. And a colleague of mine is doing now a lot of research about that. How much is the litter layer contributing to the to the water cycle, where the water is absorbed in the litter layer, doesn't reach the mineral soil, and rather evaporates back from the litter layer. So decomposing some of this is very important, both in terms of the water and, of course, also in terms of the nutrients. Yeah, and that's it. I tried to show you that some of the dryland decay mechanisms are operating today under normal conditions, of course in drylands, but also in humid ecosystems. There are humid ecosystems which are adapted to temporarily dry conditions and use dryland mechanisms for their ecosystem functioning. So this means that plants and forests and grasslands, also in humid ecosystems, can use such dryland mechanisms. And then I showed you that under extreme heat and drought, some dryland mechanisms can contribute to the functioning and of humid ecosystems, and that land management, if we think about it more, might also contribute. So we might have more resistant or resilient or whatever you want ecosystems under changed climate, if they can and if you maybe help them to use dryland mechanisms. Thank you very much. Okay, so you talk about the thresholds that have been developed by your group or the groups that you have been involved in. Yeah, so I try to focus here on dryland mechanisms, and soil respiration, as I showed before, is a general or a universal process because it's being ruled by by temperature and soil moisture. In some cases where I worked in, also by radiation. But the question could be in drylands whether these dryland mechanisms might move the thresholds. For example, so if we consider them, whether the thresholds will move to drier regions, giving more space before you have a collapse of part of your system. And this is a good point. I have no answer to that, but the direction would be, and I can think about that. The direction would be to see which dryland mechanism can contribute to shift of the thresholds to drier conditions. Yeah. Sorry. With well, first of all, yeah, because well, maybe with management, or maybe even on without management, just considering them to understand whether something should actually be a bit drier. The other question was the microbial. Oh, you didn't ask it. Yeah. No, these litter decomposition mechanisms that I talked about have not or hardly been analyzed in terms of the microbial communities that are actually active there. And I know this for years that I should be doing this and looking for collaboration, but I haven't done that so far. It is clear to me that these conditions are enabled by communities that are adapted to that. Like in our case, where at night it becomes moist and during the day it's dry. You need to have communities, bacterial and fungal communities that are adapted to that. Because we saw, for example, when we calculated potential activity of microbes, if we sampled it at night when the litter is moist or during the day when it's dry, and then we added a glucose solution, you get the same potential activity. So they remain there. These fungi and bacteria are there. Just during the day, they're in a dormant state. Once the moisture comes back, they will be active again. So you need to have a community that is adapted to these conditions. And of course, the solar radiation is very strong. The temperature is very high. They need to be in a dormant state where they can survive it. Again, you need adaptations for that. How is this being done? What populations are there? I don't know. We know a bit about the fact that there are also successional stages, because we saw that when we prevented succession from happening by not giving access to new populations to get to the litter, then the microbial degradation goes down. So you also have a succession there, which is what you always have in litter decomposition, that you have a community that makes the start, and then another community is coming in to go on with the decomposition. It probably also happens under these conditions. Sure.
So thank you very much. The net effect on forest, the canopy convector effect, is also compensated or is contracted by the albedo. So in some places they question the use of forest because there is a net. Okay, because that depends on where they are, whether they're actually cooling or warming.
Yeah, I didn't mention it to not make things more complicated. Forests are normally darker than grasslands, and their net radiation is higher, so they have a higher potential to heat up. But because of the canopy convector effect, they are able to actually cool down more than the grasslands, which to start with absorb less radiation. The canopy convector effect heats the air above it. Yeah. So the fact that you have a forest, we know that will heat the atmosphere above it. And there, then you might ask a question of, well, maybe we should do something to reduce the albedo. We can cut down all the forests, but I don't think that this is the target. But a less dense forest might have a lower albedo. It will have a more effective convector effect to remove the heat from the forest, which then heats the atmosphere above it. But we don't know much about the overall effect of it. So this has not been studied, I think, because the canopy convector effect has not been studied very much. There's more to it than I was able to say in a few minutes, but we at least will work a bit more on that. Also to try to find out the overall effect of it on the climate.
Thank you. You also have evapotranspiration that cools down the air quite a bit. So that's why I'm saying that depending on where it is, it might change the net effect on temperature. And also you have carbon uptake. So it's very complex. Anyway, the second question was about photodegradation and the fact that you said that it might be an adapted mechanism in the future, but it's also a loss of carbon from the ecosystem that doesn't get into the soil.
Yeah. I don't think we know enough about how photodegradation is interacting with the soil. Your question goes into the direction that microbial decomposition is contributing to the organic matter in the soil, because according to our newest understanding, organic matter in the soil, particularly the form that remains over long periods in the soil, is being produced by microbes. Now, what you my comment on is that photodegradation is not microbial degradation. So this is just producing CO2, which goes into the atmosphere and the carbon is lost. Whereas microbial decomposition would enrich the organic matter in the soil. But it is more complex because photodegradation is yes, it produces CO2, and I showed it in our study. You were part of that study. It produces CO2, but it also facilitates microbial decomposition, which can come at night or which can come in the next season. So the litter is mostly structural carbon, lignin, cellulose, hemicellulose, and things like that. And photodegradation is making some changes to this structure. Particularly, it can cleave some linkages between the lignin and the cellulose through the hemicellulose and open up, so to speak, the more material for microbial degradation. And if this happens, then photodegradation might release some CO2 to the atmosphere, but it also will assist or facilitate the decomposition by microbes under more moist conditions. And then you would get more organic matter in the soil. Again, we don't know what the net effect of all of this is.
Of thermal degradation with the you show us a figure showing that as you increase, the higher the temperature, the higher the photodegradation. How can you distinguish between both effects?
We try hard for many years now. We're not very successful. But in most papers on thermal degradation, they point out to the fact that probably thermal degradation does not play such a big role. When temperature is high, the combination of photodegradation and thermal degradation is higher than just photodegradation. We made measurements on the controlled conditions. This was sometimes the case, but not always. We also added humidity to see whether we have all three together. So we're not only talking about thermal and photodegradation, but also the microbial degradation that follows it at night, for example. And there we saw quite a strong synergy between the different mechanisms. But we're not able to clearly, you say, okay, there's decomposition, and now tell me how much percent is contributed by this and how much by that mechanism. We have a general understanding of that, but no clear numbers because of all kinds of interactions, and you can try to remove the actinic radiation to prevent photodegradation, but still have the heat there and see what it does. But it also changes the microclimate when you do that, and so it is complicated, and so far we don't have a clear answer to that. My general answer is that humidity enhanced microbial degradation is more important than photodegradation if you have humidity. You might be somewhere in the middle of the desert and it might be very dry and you don't have the humidity to do that. But where you get the humidity from the ocean or some other water source, as much as we saw, it contributes more to decomposition during the summer than photodegradation. But if you want the whole annual picture of it, then it's more complicated because, as I said, there's a facilitation effect of photodegradation for microbial degradation also during the next season, where when it rains and then the litter comes in different conditions. There's no clear answer. We like clear answers, but there's none. Yeah. Yeah. So we show day, night. We have abiotic during the day and biotic during the night, and this goes on. But then you have another season where you have mostly you have less radiation, cooler conditions, and more moisture. But the litter already comes in a different condition than it was at the beginning of the dry season. That is always the easiest conclusion. Yeah, we always need more research. Let our governments know that.
What Jose is trying to do, and Fernando and your group and everyone, is to try to highlight the importance of drylands, not only because they occupy a lot, but because they are mechanisms that can contribute so much to the adaptation of other types. And he's having a hard time, let's say, or not you, but anyone, not in the sense of that most of the research has been absolutely overwhelmed by temperate and dominated by other type of ecosystems, and it's hard to sometimes. So even if they receive a paper that says drylands, they say. So I think that your group has made an incredible contribution, who I'm included as well, and also Jose to do that. So yes, I think that the really interesting thing about the talk is just not only that they do exist, but they can contribute to for the adaptation of other type of ecosystems that are suffering now from different conditions that are more similar.
Yeah, definitely, and to the understanding of what's going on. So I hope that next time I submit the paper to PNAS, I will not get immediately an answer that this is from drylands and not interesting, and I should submit it to Journal of Arid Environments. So yeah, and this was part of my motivation for this paper to give more attention and try to make the point that humid ecosystems or people in researchers in humid systems, whether they want it or not, should start to pay more attention to what we are doing and what our understanding of ecosystems is, because it will become drier and hotter here. I mean, in humid ecosystems, we can contribute something to the understanding, and today I think also to the management of such systems.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.